and how he slaughtered them, all the babies, in that region, hoping that he would kill the rival king who had been born. So we know about Herod. It was in those days, the same day when Gabriel came to Zacharias and Elizabeth, the same day when Gabriel came to Mary, the same day when John was born, the day of Herod. Now Herod still was alive, though he died after the birth of Jesus. And these were the days not only of Herod ruling in Israel. By the way, Herod wasn't even a Jew. By the way, he was an Edomite. He was an Edomite, and an Edomite were despised by Israelites. They had been cursed because of the way they treated Israel and God. But nonetheless, they had an Edomite king by the name of Herod. But he was a subordinate to another king under Rome. And he was allowed to have a measure of power in Israel. Caesar Augustus was a wise man. He was. In fact, he was a brilliant and an acute man, and he gave the nation and the provinces under the authority of Rome to the Roman Empire. And he gave the province of the land that he conquered, he gave them some sense of power and some sense of freedom to operate in their own government. Sort of like the government of the United States gives the states some sense of power to rule as they desire, but it's still under the authority of the government. And so they operated their own government to lessen the tension a little bit. Or if you didn't give the states some authority, they would revolt and go against the government. So he had reason to give Herod still a little authority so that things would go pretty well with them. These were the days that Rome occupied Israel. Now there were in those days not only Roman occupation, which they despised, but they detested Roman taxation. And there's two things bothered the Jews greatly. They hated Rome and occupied because the Romans were Gentiles. Jews just flat out didn't like Gentiles. They didn't like Gentiles. They felt that Gentiles were outside the covenant. They felt Gentiles were unclean. A Jew rarely, if he was committed to his Judaized tradition, wouldn't go into the home of a Gentile because he would be defiled by even entering into his home. He wouldn't eat out of utensils prepared by Gentiles because they would be unclean and defiled. If he had to leave the border of Israel and travel in Gentile land, he would come back and he would do what became familiar phrase. He would shake off the dust before entering in Israel, lest they bring Gentile dust and dirt and pollute the nation. I mean, they just simply didn't have any love for the Gentiles. And they had no particular love for the Romans, secondly, because they had many gods, and they were a multi-god nation. They were polytheistic. And they had all kinds of idols, and idols was just not liked by Israelites. And they had, ever since the day of the Babylon captivities, they brought their idols in on banners that they were waving, on the suits of armors. They had image of Caesar. They brought their idols in, which they had, using Caesar's image on coins, and they believed Caesar to be a god. So they saw the coinage of Rome as idols. And they hated those expressions of idolatry and Gentile disbelief of the true God. And secondly, they hated Roman taxation. They didn't think Rome had any right to be in their land, and certainly they didn't think they had any right to extract taxation on them. And mostly they hated more severely the Jews who brought franchise to collect taxes from Rome. Jews would get a franchise and collect taxes from their own countrymen. And boy, were they hated. I think Zacchaeus was one of those guys. I think Matthew was one of those guys. And they were ultimately outcast. They were defectors. They were traitors. They were people, like I said, Matthew and Zacchaeus. And you meet them in the New Testament. And so they were called tax collectors. We don't like IRS people today, do we? What has changed? I mean, we still like people collecting taxes. Now, the best we can do in dating the birth of Christ is this. It came about in those days. You know, it would have been nice if Luke had said, and he couldn't have said BC because Christ hadn't been born yet. I don't know what the year was, but he said, it came about in those days. So, we're trying to figure out when were those days. Can we come to some conclusion as to when those days were? And sometime in those days, during the time of Caesar, a decree went out. Sometime, by the way, Luke is very precise, chapter 3 and verse 1, he says this, in Luke chapter 3 and verse 1, he says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was triarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip was triarch of the reign of Area, and I can't even pronounce those words, was treacherous of Abilene. Boy, that is really some specific stuff. So what he was doing was giving some direct indication exactly when Jesus was going to be born by quoting people that actually lived in history. Very specific. But sometimes he was very general. For example, in chapter 3, verse 23, when he began his ministry, Jesus himself was about 30 years of age. Now here he's not very specific. He just says, in those days, in this chapter 2, in those days a decree went out. Now I decided I want to look what a decree was. A decree is an imperial edict, the same that we find in Acts chapter 17 and verse 7. And you can use that as a comparison. Now this is common. The emperor, that's what imperials do. The emperor made an edict. He would pass a law, mandate it, give the order, and it would come from Rome, from the throne, and it would be addressed to all the subjects, and they would have certain requirements. The edict went from the emperor right out of Rome, was carried to far off Judea, and had critical bearing on the birth of Jesus Christ. So from Rome, the governor had an edict that affected Joseph living in Judea. And Judea was 80 miles or so from Bethlehem. And he had to go to Bethlehem because of specific reasons where they had to go to have their census made. Now, let's look at the edict. The edict that came out of Rome went out from the reign of Caesar of that day, Caesar Augustus. Neither of those is his name. Caesar is the title like a king, or emperor, or pharaoh. It's not his name. Augustus is not a name. It took me all these years to realize that Caesar Augustus wasn't his name. Bill, I should have asked you. It's amazing. But Caesar Augustus wasn't his name.
Augustus was his title.
That's just brilliant. Couldn't get it. Augustus is an objective to describe somebody.
Yeah.
Well, Bill, you should have told me that. I didn't. My goodness. Augustus means august, revered, highly esteemed, highly regarded, honored. So this decree came out from one of the Caesars, who was called Augustus because he was given that name as an indication of how they honored him. Now the question is, who was Caesar Augustus? I'm sure you want to know. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm sure you want to know. You like the History Channel. You want to know who he is, frankly. This able ruler of Rome Empire was born, I'm sure you want to know, September 23rd of 63 BC. Now put that down and it'll be in the next test. His name was, his name when he was born was Augustus Octavian. Later on, he became, and is often referred to as Octavian. Now, Gaius Octavius was born in 63 BC before Christ. Had a mother named Atia. Atia. His mother, Atia, was the daughter of Julia, and Julia was the sister of Julius Caesar. You didn't know that, I bet, Phyllis. Now, this made Augustus Octavius the great-grandnephew to Julius Caesar. Isn't this getting interesting? Yes, it is. So he was born in a high place. For whatever reason, Julius Caesar took a tremendous liking to this boy, like Carlos, you know. He adored little Gaius Octavius, and he lavished him with gifts, and he honored him. Well, Gaius had reached the age of 20, and Julius adopted him as his own son and declared him to be the heir to the throne of the Roman Empire, literally establishing the future at this point. 1 year later, it was 1 year later that Julius Caesar was murdered. And when he was murdered, at that point, Gaius learned of his choice as Julius Caesar heir. And at this point, he changed his name back to Gaius Julius Caesar in honor of his adoptive father. So, he really got a silver spoon in his mouth. And he headed for the throne. And Caesar, you remember, was murdered by his friends. Who murdered him? A.T. Brutale. And one of his sisters was married to Mark Antony. And Mark Antony is very, very dominant figure in Roman history, as all of you know. So here he was, the great-nephew of Julius Caesar, adopted as the son and heir. His sister married Mark Antony, who was a powerful person, and at the death of Julius Caesar, 3 people reigned in Rome. It wasn't that immediately that Octavius was pushed into that place, there were 3. Well, so there were 3 people ruling in Rome. It wasn't long until the first ruler fell out, and the rule of Rome was left Octavius and Mark Antony. They ruled together for a while until Mark Antony began to do things that bothered Octavius. First thing he did was he left his wife. And his wife, as I told you, was the sister of Octavius. You don't leave your sister, so it made his son-in-law mad. He didn't like that, and he left his wife because he became infatuated with the legendary and bewitching Cleopatra. You know, that happened with Cleopatra and Mark Antony, you know, Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. It actually happened. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, who really is legendary, and her power of seduction and the ability was bewitching. Well, she bewitched Mark Antony successfully. Eventually, he began to show more concern for Egypt, more concern for the success of Cleopatra, more concern for her personally, and his own welfare than he did for Rome. And so the irritation of Octavius began to escalate. After all, he had divorced his sister, and now he was turning his heart away from Rome. This could make a good movie, couldn't it?
Yep.
The result of all of this was tremendous conflict between Mark Antony and Octavius, which ultimately brought them to a great battle. A battle that the Egyptians never should have gotten involved in the first place. It was called the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. And at that battle, Octavius literally devastated and destroyed the power of Mark Antony and poor Cleopatra, and became sole ruler of the Roman Empire in 31 BC, in which that occurred. Both Mark Antony and Cleopatra, soon after that, committed suicide, and Octavius took the rule. Isn't that amazing? You say, what's all that got to do with anything? Well, God had a plan for Gaius, Julius Caesar. He brought about the amazing Pax Romana. P-A-X-R-O-M-A-N-A. This was critical. This is so critical. The Roman peace was often called Max Augustus.